This is the sort of thing that Putin would never do because, I mean, you just have to remember his ridiculously long tables during COVID. He was completely terrified of catching COVID, and he's not a brave man, Putin. He's never been willing to put himself at any degree of personal danger, and you can see that throughout the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1392 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale war in Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking once again to Jimmy Rushton. Now, Jimmy is a Kyiv-based foreign policy and security analyst currently focused on the Russian illegal invasion in Ukraine as a freelance journalist. And he's a determined soul who has put a lot of effort into making sure that we can have a chat today, because I think this is our third attempt at connecting after the internet has been playing us up. But Jimmy, welcome back to Frontline and thank you for your persistence.
Thanks for having me.
Now, interesting things going on at the moment. One of the ones I wanted to start off with was talking to you about what's going on in Kupiansk, because at the end of November, the Russians said they'd captured the whole of the town of Kupiansk. They even took the general that was in charge, and Vladimir Putin made a big thing of giving him a big medal and suggesting that he would take international press down and show them how they'd captured Kupiansk. And then, of course, a couple of days ago, President Zelensky took a selfie from just outside Kupiansk after the Ukrainians had kicked the Russians out of it effectively. What's going on?
It was an extremely effective counteroffensive planned and executed by Kharkiv Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard, along with a bunch of other units. The Russians have been trying to capture Kupiansk ever since the Ukrainians initially kicked them out of there. They captured it in the opening stages of the full-scale invasion. Then during the Kharkiv counteroffensive in September and October 2022, the Ukrainians pushed them back, and the Russians have been trying to capture this town ever since. And yeah, it was an extremely effective military operation, which really shows that when the Ukrainian soldiers are well-led, well-trained, and well-equipped, they fight extremely effectively.
Now, it seems that the Ukrainians are getting a greater number of formations and units that are well-trained, better equipped, and increasingly well-led. Because again, we're seeing similar commentary coming out of the Russians about Pokrovsk. And they've said, I think I've lost count the number of times they've said they've captured the whole of Pokrovsk. And it seems in the last 48 hours, the Ukrainians have put a big effort into opening up the logistic lines so that they are widening the jaws of this cauldron that the Russians have been trying to close around it. And it's quite clear that the Russians do not have control of that city. Do you see Pokrovsk being potentially liberated in the way that Kupiansk was?
I don't, no, unfortunately. I think the situation in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk is slightly different. In Kupiansk, they hadn't really taken the city, or they pushed small numbers of troops into Kupiansk and they held a small section of it. But what you're seeing in Pokrovsk is very much different. The Russians control the majority of that city, and I can't see the Ukrainians, at least in the short to medium term, being able to liberate Pokrovsk, unfortunately. The Russians have definitely expended more effort into taking Pokrovsk and other cities and towns in the Donbass, because Kupiansk is in Kharkiv Oblast, not traditionally considered as part of the Donbass, but it's kind of a secondary objective for the Russians. So unfortunately, no, I don't see the Ukrainians liberating Pokrovsk anytime soon.
But do you think the Ukrainians are right in this balancing act that they're carrying out, that the cost of holding Pokrovsk against the cost it is to the Russians to try and take Pokrovsk is, in the Ukrainians' favor at the moment? They're costing the Russians an awful lot more. And do you see that changing? Do you see a decision coming at some stage soon where Ukraine will withdraw from Pokrovsk to take the Russians to their next defensive line?
I do. I think it's always difficult to know the exact ratio, but when it comes down to street by street fighting, it's almost a coin toss, really. Regardless of how well trained your guys are, it's really who gets sight on the enemy first. And you can be the best trained operator in the world, and if the guy who's had 2 days of perfunctory Russian training sees you first and he gets a shot on you with his AK, I mean, it's over. So I think what you've seen, one of the key criticisms of Syrsky, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, is that he's held on to positions for too long. I think, especially in the case of Monohrad, which is to the east of Pokrovsk, that's absolutely true. The Ukrainian soldiers should have been withdrawn from there weeks, maybe months ago, because they are, if not fully encircled, operationally encircled. And I think a full encirclement is potentially on the cards. Some of the, I think it's the 36th Marine Brigade that's in there, and they talked to Ukrainian media, and they essentially said that they're almost entirely encircled at this point. And obviously, that leaving troops to be encircled in almost all cases is a terrible thing. You never want to be surrounded by the enemy. I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but there are some cases where you might leave troops to be encircled if you are mounting an imminent counter-offensive, or you think the enemy is overextending themselves. But in this case, it was a slow, determined Russian advance. Everyone saw it coming, and those troops were left there to be encircled. And the biggest problem now is that when they're trying to do casualty evacuations, when they're trying to run logistics into Monohrad and parts of Pokrovsk as well, they're suffering very severe losses. You're also seeing losses amongst the drone pilots, because the drone pilots have to be relatively close to the front line or to the zero line, because you want to be able to strike as far into the enemy rear as possible. So these FPV drones, they have a battery life of about 20-25 minutes, and obviously the further you are behind your lines, the safer you might be, but the damage you can do to the Russians' logistics, because that's what they tend to go for. They go for logistics, and they go for infantry forces, is more limited. So you're seeing, because of this kind of encirclement and this gray zone of indeterminate control, don't really have like a defined front line anymore. You just have like a 15-kilometer zone of complete chaos, where you have small groups of Russian and Ukrainian troops holding positions and intermingling with each other. And yeah, it's very difficult. And I think, come back to your question, I think the ratio has probably switched to still in the Ukrainians' favor, but not enough in the Ukrainians' favor, in my opinion. And speaking to Ukrainian soldiers that I know that are in that area, that's pretty much what they say to me at the moment.
Okay, interesting. Now, morale is a big part of this, and we had Zelensky going right up to the front line. You're within 2 kilometers of the Russian positions, clearly well within FPV drone striking distance. How much does that sort of leadership that he shows play out from a positive perspective across the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military? And is that doing something to try and repair the damage that's been caused by the very recent accusations of corruption?
Yeah, so the one thing about Zelensky that's always been true is he has always demonstrated a significant amount of personal bravery. From the start of the full-scale invasion, when he remained in Kyiv, when a lot of people thought he was going to flee, up until today, he's always been willing to put himself at not inconsiderable risk. Because whenever you go close to the front line, I mean, and he went very close, but whenever you go, say, within 15, 20 kilometers in the front line, everything is observed. Drones are pretty much constant of all types. You're in artillery range, you're in airstrike range with the Russian glide bombs. So lots of things can go wrong really quickly when you're that close to the front line. So yeah, he displays significant personal bravery, and that is to some degree a morale booster to the troops. I mean, you actually saw this on the Russian side as well. If you remember Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the commander of Wagner, he would also go to the front line. He would surround himself with his troops. He would get very, very close. And he also demonstrated a significant amount of personal bravery, and that also inspired the Wagner guys and the Russian troops that he was leading. So it does matter in war, and this is the sort of thing that Putin would never do, because, I mean, you just have to remember his ridiculously long tables during COVID. He was completely terrified of catching COVID, and he's not a brave man, Putin. He's never been willing to put himself at any degree of personal danger, and you can see that throughout the war. So yeah, it's a morale booster. In regards to has it repaired his reputation in regards to the corruption allegations, he has taken a personal hit in his popularity in Ukraine. That being said, he fired his very unpopular, significantly more unpopular than he is, Chief of Staff Andrei Yermak, who Ukrainians had wanted gone for God knows how long, ever since he really stepped into the position. And I would speak to Ukrainians that would be pro-Zelensky, and they'd be like, well, we like Zelensky, but we don't like Yermak. We don't like the amount of power that he's got, because he had significant power over and above his position as head of the presidential office. They didn't like some of the people that he appointed to positions. They didn't like the fact that he was representing Ukraine on the international stage when he really shouldn't have been doing that. He that role was not. Yeah, it didn't give him the mandate to negotiate for the Ukrainian people, because he wasn't appointed, he wasn't elected, and he wasn't appointed by the Rada either. So it has helped him getting rid of Yermak, but I think the damage has still been done. And I think when you see further allegations and further revelations from this NABU investigation, NABU being the anti-corruption police in Ukraine, you'll probably see him, coming under more pressure again.
But do you think that these anti-corruption investigations that are coming out, the positive thing is they are identifying people who are in very powerful positions, and those people are having to move on. Whereas, if you go back to some of the older regimes, they wouldn't be allowed to identify publicly individuals in powerful positions, because those individuals would be able to control what these anti-corruption investigators were doing. So, from a wider constitutional perspective and airing your dirty laundry in public perspective, it's actually showing Ukraine is in a position now to deal with corruption allegations in a much better way, and therefore, not necessarily Zelensky, but the Ukrainian government as a whole is going to be seen as stronger because of the fact that these individuals are being outed.
I think that's true. Look, Ukraine is not Russia. Ukraine isn't even the United States, where the president can pardon his friends when they commit huge amounts of financial fraud, which has happened on multiple occasions. So Ukrainian elites are actually kind of terrified of NABU. They are efficient. They are capable. They really aren't scared. I mean, they're careful. So when they're building a case against someone that's powerful in the Ukrainian political system, obviously they're careful when they do that, and they want to make sure all their T's are crossed and their I's are dotted. But as you've seen, they're prepared to go after the highest echelons of the Ukrainian political elite. And yeah, again, that's admirable, and it really shows that Ukraine is a country that deeply cares about corruption. And if you speak to Ukrainian people, their number one complaint when they're talking about their government is corruption, and that's been the case of every government. So it is making it's making progress. It needs to make more progress, and I think there have been serious missteps by the government in the way they've handled this. But it has to be said that this is a country that is not happy with corruption by and large. The Euromaidan protests, one thing that people kind of forget is that it wasn't just about Europe. They were largely anti-corruption protests as well, because the Ukrainian people saw moving towards the EU as moving away from the corrupt and kleptocratic Russian system. It's no coincidence that all countries that have exited the Russian sphere of influence, the post-Soviet countries, if you will, have all had problems with corruption. It's because of this malign influence of Russian Soviet imperialism going back 100 years. So yeah, it's a country that is fighting against corruption, and then it needs to do more. It absolutely needs to do more, but nobody's perfect at the end of the day, and this is a country at war as well. So
and of course, Zelensky was the first president to be elected on a proper anti-corruption ticket, and he wasn't very popular whenever he first got elected, because he was starting to try and deal with corruption, and that was undermining a lot of those in power who thought that they were secure in power and didn't like it being taken away from them. And then when the war started, that's when his popularity started to go up again. So if we put that in terms of any of the other democracies across Europe, Ukraine is still very much in its infancy, if not in nappies or diapers, depending on who's listening to this. It's the same thing. And therefore we shouldn't criticize as much as we do, because it's got a long path to go, and we've all been along that long path.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, we entered into World War II to protect the independence of Poland, which was a corrupt and autocratic state at the time. Just because the Ukrainian government has problems with corruption, and it does, doesn't mean that Ukrainians should be sentenced to live under Russian occupation. That's just, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous statement. So, okay, Ukraine's corrupt and there's issues with corruption, so therefore we should just surrender these people to Russian imperialism, Russian occupation, and all of the deprivations and the horrific abuses that happen under Russian occupation, and they are absolutely horrific. You can just read the testimonies of Ukrainians that have returned from the occupied territories or that have been liberated during the Ukrainian counteroffensives. You wouldn't want anyone to live under those conditions. So yeah, there are problems with corruption in Ukraine, but it's a young country, it's a growing country. What gives me the most amount of hope when I speak to Ukrainians is the way that young Ukrainians are so committed to good governance and democratic norms and anti-corruption. It's a country where when the government tried to remove the independence of Nabo and Sapo, young Ukrainians came out onto the streets in their thousands all across the country to defend these institutions, even in cities like Kharkiv, which is 30 minutes away from the Russian border, which is bombed every day. And you have almost no warning of ballistic missile strikes and glide bomb strikes in Kharkiv. But these young Ukrainians still came out to protest, to defend their country's democratic institutions. And this shows me, and it should show, I think, everyone, that this is a country that's worth saving. And it has its problems, but those problems are not, they're not irredeemable. They're not unique to Ukraine either. Like every country has problems with corruption.
I want to find a leader across Europe who could hand on heart turn around and say there's no corruption in my country, and you wouldn't be able to find it at all. But again, this is being reflected in some of the polls that are coming out across Ukraine at the moment, because with the 28-day peace plan that came from the Russians via the Americans, and then that was translated into a 24-point peace plan, then a 19-point peace plan, back up to a 20-point peace plan, with meetings going on in Berlin over the last couple of days between President Zelensky and Steve Witkoff from the United States. And we, as we're recording this, haven't heard the outcome of those meetings yet. But one of the things that seems to be firm, and one of the things that President Zelensky seems to have taken a bit of an initiative on, is carrying out as close an accurate survey of the thoughts of the Ukrainian people as he possibly can. And some of those thoughts are saying that over 80% don't want to give up any territory for peace. They would still support continuing to fight. They don't want the Donbass to be handed over to the Russians. They don't want Ukrainian troops to be told to withdraw from the elements of the Donbass, even if the front lines are frozen where they are at the moment. What are you hearing, and what are you seeing from those polls that have happened?
This has been consistent, really, from whenever peace is discussed, whenever the kind of negotiations are brought up, whenever the conditions for ending the war are brought up. Ukrainians are very consistent. They don't want to give up land. They especially don't want to surrender territory which isn't currently occupied to Russian occupation. Because again, we talked about the deprivations that happen under Russian occupation. It's not just land, it's people. Lots of people, that are patriotic Ukrainians that want to live under Ukrainian rule, still wouldn't want to leave their homes. Because, for example, if you're a relatively poor Ukrainian who's got a house in Kramatorsk, what do? You do you just surrender your home and flee into internal exile in another part of Ukraine, or do you stay under Russian occupation? So yeah, it's not just territory, it's people. The other reason why so many Ukrainians think like this is because they know that these peace talks aren't really serious. The Russians are not actually just interested in the small sliver of Donetsk Oblast that they don't currently occupy. They're interested in the rest of Kherson Oblast. They're interested in the rest of Zaporizhzhia Oblast as well. And they've said this explicitly, that the terms are not going to be acceptable to them. And the problem is we keep, when I say we, I mean in the West, we keep looking at the statements Russia makes and thinking that this is a normal state. This is a state where their public pronouncements have any relation to the truth, and that they're not constantly lying, because they are. So yeah, and this is a country where we had the Minsk agreements, we had multiple treaties, we had Russian law which said that they weren't allowed to go to war against Ukraine, and they've just ignored all of it. You obviously remember the run-up to February 2022, when every member of the Russian government was saying, we do not plan to invade Ukraine. what they say is meaningless. The only thing they understand is force, and they are playing. They're especially playing the Trump administration along, as Trump would like to say. They're tapping him along. They really, all they're doing essentially is engaging with the Americans enough that the Americans aren't going to send uh, more levels of support to Ukraine. It's no coincidence that this 28-point peace plan miraculously appeared when Ukraine was discussing getting Tomahawk cruise missiles from the Americans. At that, there were serious discussions about this, and then Putin phoned Trump, and all of a sudden, the Tomahawks are off the table, and we have this ridiculous 28-point peace plan, which was given to Witkoff by Kirill Dmitriev. And yeah, that's where we are now. The Russian promises can't be trusted. Ukrainians know this. And that's why they are not going to go along with some form of peace plan that gives territory to Russia, that doesn't give them security guarantees, that includes caps on the Ukrainian military. Especially not with cast iron security guarantees from Western countries, which would have to include the deployment of Western troops on the ground. Again, something Russia has categorically refused to allow.
And it's interesting that the coalition of the willing, I don't think, has managed to come up with the numbers of troops that would be needed if you were going to properly come into the ground. But the other thing that seems to have gone in, and something that Donald Trump's been pushing quite hard, he's called Zelensky's government illegitimate because there haven't been elections. And President Zelensky seems to be taking the initiative of trying to get the Ukrainian constitution changed, which currently doesn't allow elections when there's martial law on, but to get elections brought in. You're looking at what those polls were saying, looking at, you living in Ukraine, get the feeling of the Ukrainian people, and look what President Zelensky is doing. Do you think he's been clever and finding a way of pushing this difficult issue off with Donald Trump? Do you think that if he does get to a point where he's forced to have elections, and he has elections, he would be re-elected again as president? And the people go, no, you're the wartime leader. We'll let you stay as the wartime leader.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very stupid comment by Trump, as per usual, calling the Ukrainian government illegitimate when it is just following the provisions set out in the Ukrainian constitution. I think if Zelensky, I mean, there are so many technical questions that would have to be solved if you want to run an election during wartime, not least because you'd have to work out, well, which parts of Ukraine get to vote. Is it all of Ukraine? Is it Ukraine under Ukrainian control? What about Ukrainians that are currently out of the country? How are you going to secure the security and the safety of polling stations, assuming you have in-person polling and you don't just do it all digitally, in which case then that would obviously be the target of aggressive cyber attacks by the Russians. So, there's so many questions, and it's a distraction for the Ukrainian government, obviously. I think what Zelensky is doing is relatively clever. He's not categorically refusing it. He's saying, well, if we are going to have elections, there's going to be, there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of problems that we need to kind of address in order to carry them out successfully. If he ran, if there were elections and if Zelensky ran, I think it would probably be a closer run thing than people think now. And I think that simply because domestic politics, whilst it hasn't been completely suspended in Ukraine, Zelensky's chief rivals, people like Poroshenko and increasingly Zaluzhny, who's the ex-Ukrainian commander-in-chief, now ambassador in London, they have really been, for the most part, pulling their punches. So I think if you saw some form of, I don't know, presidential campaign, you would obviously see politics returning, and you would see people criticizing Zelensky for things that they think that he's done wrong during the war. And there are lots of criticisms of Zelensky, particularly in the early part of the war. It's a common criticism is why the South was so poorly defended, why the Russians were able to drive so far, in the South, why key bridges weren't destroyed, why the military wasn't better prepared. And obviously all of this would come out in a presidential campaign, or it probably would. Obviously it depends on who decides to run. It's very possible that if he is seen to be forced to hold elections, certain candidates might decide to not run because they might view, if they did win, the perception that they're being installed by the Americans as not particularly favorable to them. So, yeah, I think it would be a close run thing. I think Zelensky would very possibly win, or the other person that could win would be Zelensky, who is also very popular here now.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Well, Zelensky is certainly increasing his political profile, and we can see him becoming more statesman-like as he does things away from his military command. So, we're coming to the end of our time. What's going to happen through the rest of? Well, there's very little of 2025 left. What are your predictions for what's going to happen early 2026?
It's always difficult to make predictions in this kind of conflict. But what I would say is, I think you're going to see a continuing grinding, slow Russian advance, which will be incredibly costly to them and will gain some territory, but territory that doesn't really make any significant changes in the state of the war. I don't see these peace negotiations going anywhere at this point. The differences between the two sides, actually three sides, because the Americans are making a lot of stupid demands as well at this point. The differences between the sides is just so vast. And I think the other problem that both the Americans and the Russians don't seem to understand is that Zelensky cannot just capitulate on Ukrainians' behalf. The Ukrainians just won't stand for it. If he tried to sign something that was viewed as a surrender, he'd be removed from power. He would not survive. And again, it's understanding the nature of Ukrainian society, understanding that this is not Russia. It's not the United States either. It's a country where the people have significant amounts of power, and if they don't like the actions of the government, they will remove that government, as we've seen multiple times in Ukrainian history. So I think that the Russian offensive continues, peace talks go relatively nowhere. Hopefully you'll still see the campaign of Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian targets. I think you'll also see increasingly strikes on tankers in the Dark Fleet, the Shadow Fleet, which you're seeing increasingly now. And again, you never know what the Ukrainians are cooking up. There might be another Operation Spiderweb just around the corner. We won't know it until you start seeing videos on Twitter of Russian planes exploding mysteriously. So yeah, the other thing I would say is that despite hysterical commentary, there's no danger of the Ukrainian military collapsing. The front line, it's difficult, but it's not difficult to the point where the Russians are in danger of staging a major breakthrough. Even if I don't even know if the Russians could, I don't even know if the Russians could actually exploit a breakthrough in the traditional sense at this point, because their forces have been degraded to the point where they can advance, but they advance using very small groups of infantry. They don't really use that many mechanized assaults and tanks anymore. I mean, they do use them, but when they do use tanks, they're kind of converted into these really Mad Max contraptions where the actual fighting ability of the tank is completely sacrificed to add extra armor onto it. So it's not really a tank anymore. It's kind of like a crappy armored personnel carrier. And to be fair, the armor does protect it against drones, but again, it removes the ability of the tank to fire its main gun, to rotate its turret, or to do anything that a tank would traditionally do. So the question of whether the Russian military could even exploit a breakthrough at this point, I think is open. So yeah, I think that's it.
Well, no, it's interesting. I read recently a piece which said that the Russian generals didn't want to actually get to a point where they broke through or changed anything, because they're making an awful lot of money out of just sending people through the meat grinder and everything else. But that's something that we can discuss in more detail at another opportunity. Jimmy Rushton, it's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Times Radio Frontline today. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.